Hello, and welcome to another video in my Fundamentals of Orchestration series. In my last video, I demonstrated how you can use the overtone series as a guideline for spacing notes of a chord in an orchestral texture. Once you understand the basic principle of voicing chords, you can purposefully go against these guidelines in order to achieve your desired sound. Today, I'll be looking at many examples from the canon of Western classical music, specifically examples of homophonic textures that can help in our understanding of chord spacing. Several of these examples demonstrate chord spacings that reflect the overtone series, and several do not. We'll discuss the composer's methods and intentions behind each example. I've used orchestral sample libraries to realize each example, though keep in mind that my sample library collection is of course limited, and these are by no means perfect renditions. I will always recommend listening to a real orchestra recording, or better yet, a live performance for a more authentic experience. However, using software has some advantages, for instance, the ability to dissect each instrumental part or section within the orchestra for a better understanding of the score. With all that said, let's get started with the first example. The first set of examples is from Brahms's Third Symphony, composed in 1883, and scored for double winds plus contrabassoon, 4 horns, 2 trumpets, 3 trombones, timpani, and strings. While written near the end of the 19th century, to me this work reflects many of the orchestrational principles of the Romantic period, specifically in terms of voicing chords. This first example is from the opening 3 measures of the first movement. We start with 2 consecutive chords in the winds and brass. Notice how the first chord is in a closed position, meaning there are no gaps between chord tones. Because these notes are mostly in an upper middle register, we don't have any issues with balance or muddiness. The next chords expand outward, and we get progressively larger spaces between chords. The last chord is spaced much wider overall, with closed spacing in the middle of the chord and wider spacing on either end. The large gaps in the low end reflect the harmonic series, therefore helping to create balance or sturdiness, if you will. The large gap in the high range allows for the violins to pierce through the texture as they take over with the melody. I'd like to take the time now to mention how the timbre of each individual instrument in a chord contributes to the overall timbre of the complete texture. Each individual instrument's timbre changes depending on where that instrument is within its own range. For instance, we can think of a flute as having 3 parts of its range, each part being about an octave. The lowest octave is weak in volume, but has a very beautifully warm and velvety sound. The next octave gets progressively brighter, and you'll find a lot of the orchestral flute writing sits in this range. Here, the flute has a wide dynamic range, and many woodwind voicings feature the flute just above the treble clef staff. As you go higher, it becomes more difficult to play softer. The highest octave can be piercing and is used in brighter textures with a lot of force. An important step in becoming a good orchestrator is knowing about each instrument and how they sound at all parts of their ranges. I've talked a lot about balancing chords using careful spacing, but another large part of achieving balance is which notes you give to each instrument and how those timbres blend together. It can be particularly challenging with woodwinds, as there are more differences in timbres between instruments within this family than in the brass and certainly within the string section. Here, Brahms uses a combination of juxtaposition, interlocking, and overlapping of the woodwind voices. In general, he juxtaposes the winds from high to low, starting with the flute, then oboe, then clarinet, then bassoon. He occasionally overlaps flutes with oboes, and also oboes with clarinets to achieve a more homogeneous sound, but this only blends well if each note can match volume without distorting the timbre. This would be especially true for interlocking instruments. If the first chord in the woodwinds was transposed down a third or more, for example, the second oboe's timbre would likely not blend with the interlocking clarinet notes because of where those notes lie on the instrument. It's a complicated mess of information to keep track of, but once you learn about each instrument, it all starts to make sense. Looking at the brass here, Brahms relies on the horns to blend with the winds, and as the trumpets move higher in register, they begin to cut through the texture. He introduces the trombones in the third chord here to add power alongside the strings. Speaking of the strings, the basses are alone on that fundamental of the chord. Actually, I think contrabassoons are with them. Somehow I left that out. The celli are divided into two, with the root and fifth. It's very common to have celli and violas divided like this. You get a much fuller sound without getting too muddy. This example to me represents a very early to mid-19th century sound. Nothing unusual here, and everything balances well. Okay, let's move on to example 2. The second example shows another F major chord, this time scored more thinly with the winds spread in octaves and the strings and horns providing a warm sound from a relatively low voicing. Each of the string instruments are playing notes on their lowest respective string, which helps give each note of that string section a darker timbre. In the winds, the flutes and clarinets provide a more rounded sound without the oboes. The second clarinet part is perhaps a bit weak in comparison to the first clarinet and flutes, but Brahms treats this octave texture as more of a rhythmic motive device than a balanced chord. Moving on to example 3. Here we have a first inversion F major chord, and there are certain rules that you might consider when scoring a first inversion chord. Brahms places the third of the chord, the A, in only the lowest octaves, with the exception of the violin 2 figure, which I'll discuss more in a moment. A lot of the low power comes from those octave A's, while the upper winds, trumpets, violins, and violas provide a balance to that with the tonic and fifth of the chord. It's generally a good idea to avoid overdoing the third of the chord in the upper octaves. In terms of spacing, we see large spaces between low instruments and close spacing in the middle and high registers. The trumpets in octaves is a nice way to add emphasis to the tonic. And the upper wind scoring guarantees a strong sound here. If Brahms had scored the brass much higher or filled in the gaps of the trumpets, the upper woodwinds might be overpowered. So by leaving room for the winds, we get a better balance between brass and winds. One thing that surprised me here was that the violin 2s are enclosed within the violas. My reduction here doesn't show the rhythms that they're playing, but my best guess as to the reason for this enclosed voicing is that Brahms assumed that it would be easier to tune, especially if these notes were to be played with double stops as opposed to divided. Of course, there's also a slight timbral difference here from a more common juxtaposed voicing, but I found this to be unusual. In example 4, I want to look specifically at the strings and how these two measures get progressively warmer sounding as the violas move down in register. The octave gap between violas and violins in the second measure might seem too wide here, but I think it actually makes the overall texture more fragile and almost tragic sounding. Also, Brahms wanted to make this viola line stand out, and if he'd had filled in the octave, you might lose the viola line's independence. The violins have relatively easy double stops here because of the open strings, and the downbeat in measure 2 with double stops has a very rich and resonant sound because of those open strings. Example 5 features a powerful A minor chord in an interesting configuration. The strings are in a wide juxtaposed scoring with a heavy emphasis on the tonic A, which, to be fair, in context is the melody note here. The middle range of the strings is not nearly as strong here, as the violas won't bring quite as much force, but that's fine. That middle range will be enforced by the brass. It's interesting that the trumpets are scored fairly low here in comparison to the strings and winds, but I think Brahms just didn't want the trumpets to cut through too much. The winds are in a similar overlapping voicing to earlier examples and help to enforce that tonic, as well as the minor third. Example 6 is one of my favorite moments in this symphony, and to me demonstrates as well as any moment that romantic sound that we associate with the 19th century. Let's look at this example starting with the low end. We have the basses, cello, and contrabassoon in unison on the tonic, with the bassoons scored a fifth and 10th above the root. At a soft dynamic, the bassoons and low strings create this wonderfully warm texture. Meanwhile, the upper strings have a syncopated rhythm that helps to emphasize the overall descending gesture. To me, this is a very pianistic texture, and you can imagine Brahms composing this figure at the piano. The beauty of this moment comes from the solo horn rising above the strings, culminating in the suspended ninth of the chord in beat 4 of the third measure. The last example from Brahms is the final chord of this movement. The strings are scored with an overlapping voicing that features intervals of fifths or sixths between notes, so not super closed voicing, but also not super wide voicing either. The strings are positioned relatively low, which creates a warmer sound. The low strings voiced very low and the upper strings in their medium register. This leaves room in the upper register for the woodwinds, which feature closed overlapping voicings in the flutes, oboes, and clarinets, with the exception of the first flute sitting alone on that high F. This flute ends up sticking out a bit in the texture, especially with the low overall dynamic of the orchestra, but this is a fairly common sound of that era. In the brass, the low horns are doubled with the trombones, which creates a rich and mellow timbre, one that blends nicely with the low strings and bassoons. Overall, this chord captures that Brahms symphonic sound quite well, and is a great model for voicing a diatonic triad. The second set of examples is from another 19th century composer, and although this piece was written well before Brahms's Third Symphony, this piece is known for its innovations in compositional and orchestrational technique. This composer famously wrote a treatise on orchestration that remained relevant well into the 20th century. The piece is none other than Berlioz's Symphony Fantastique, composed in 1830, which features many strange and beautiful moments, and I've chosen to look at a few of them, specifically for chord voicing. The first example demonstrates a bright and energized sound, featuring tremolo strings scored in a relatively high position. The violins above the treble clef here create a bright, shimmering texture that blends with the closed, juxtaposed woodwinds. The second chord features one wind on a part, which we haven't really seen yet. This is partially due to having 4 notes to the chord. The clarinets are also higher in register than we ever saw in the Brahms. High clarinets have a very piercing sound, which adds to the brightness here. Finally, the horns fill up the middle register here in closed voicing. The next example features another first inversion chord, where the third of the chord is voiced only in the lower octaves. So we have a relatively high positioning of closed voicing upper woodwinds, which results in a very bright fortissimo sound. We also have an interesting organization of upper strings, where both violins and violas have a double stop that includes the open A string. Unfortunately, with sample libraries, I can't recreate the sound of that double stop exactly, so some of the uniqueness of this chord is missing. Overall, to me, this isn't my favorite scoring, as the C sharp dominates the low to mid registers and doesn't blend as well in the upper strings and winds. And even when I listened to live recordings, I felt kind of similarly. The third example from Symphony Fantastique is from the end of the first movement, labeled Religiosamente. This example features a chorale-like texture with textbook contrapuntal voice leading. I included this example because of the low wind scoring, which blends nicely with the horns and violins here. As we've seen in earlier examples, the overall low voicing leads to a warmer sound, but not a muddy one, even with closed intervals in the strings and horns in the bass clef. Berlioz is also careful to not overdo the bass line here. The next example is one of my favorite moments in this piece, and it comes at the start of the fourth movement. Notice how the basses are divided here, almost turning them into percussion instruments. With such a low chord, it's difficult to hear individual pitches of this bass pizzicato chord, but the effect is very clear. I should note that my reduction here does not include timpani, which is also featured prominently in the opening. I'll talk in detail about percussion writing in a future video. So this low pizzicato drum-like texture continues throughout this passage, and the notes change according to the chord. The opening horn duet is soon joined by 2 more horns and 2 bassoons. Combining bassoons and horns is very common, as they blend well in medium to low dynamic levels. Notice how low these horns are scored. Because the texture is relatively thin and homogeneous, it doesn't sound overly muddy. As Berlioz adds in the additional low brass, he builds the power of the brass texture. He's not trying to create a clean sound at the end here, he's just trying to create intensity and power, which he definitely accomplishes. The next example contrasts the previous one in many ways, one of which is the spacing of chords. This example demonstrates a very typical brass and wind band scoring, where the flutes and oboes are in an octave above the trumpets, and the horns double the clarinets and bassoons in the middle register. The trombone ostinato on the tonic plus the tuba pedal provide stability without the need for low strings. Notice the repeated F in the trumpets and horns in measure 2 and 3 as the harmony changes. This is very idiomatic for brass instruments and helps to create that fanfare-like texture, along with the syncopated rhythms that they have. The next example demonstrates the power of 4 horns and 3 trombones in a very simple parallel thirds gesture. The trombones are capable of a lot of power in this range, and to balance this force, Berlioz uses 2 horns for each note. This is an example of keeping things simple but effective. The next example uses the same dies irae melody, this time in unison octaves in the winds and brass. I find that you can always learn a lot from examples like this because the objective is very clear, a balanced fortissimo sound that packs a punch. Looking at the brass, you have 2 trombones and 2 bassoons starting at middle C. This combination provides power and clarity. This is balanced by a more rounded solo tuba part that at fortissimo fills up the low range with a powerful wall of sound. To balance the rest of the brass, Berlioz doubles this upper C with 2 horns and 2 trumpets. The trumpets in the middle part of their range plus 2 horns in the upper part of their range provide enough power to balance the low brass. If the trumpets were to be up the octave, Berlioz would probably need to add 2 more horns to balance the trumpets. In the woodwinds, we have the E-flat clarinet in unison with the first oboe. This type of clarinet is piercing in its high range, although notoriously difficult to tune. The final example from Berlioz is the final chord from the 5th movement. The strings are in a wide spacing with overlapping violin 1s and 2s. Interestingly enough, the basses are pitched relatively high, but this is partially due to the texture of the previous several measures. The entire orchestra leading up to this final measure has 8th notes, and double basses aren't the most agile of instruments, probably more agile in their upper range, so that's a possible reasoning for the high bass note here. In the brass, we have a relatively closed voicing with overlapping trumpets, horns, and trombones, which creates a very rich and bright texture. The 2 unison tubas help to balance the chord in the lower octave alongside the basses. Finally, the woodwinds are scored in a relatively high overlapping voicing that features a piccolo and E-flat clarinet, which all contribute to a very bright wind sound. So that's it for this video. I think you can really learn a lot from both of these composers, and I hope that I've provided some helpful examples with some insightful comments and demonstrations. Stay tuned for part 2, where I'll be looking at a few examples from the late 19th century and early 20th century. See you next time.